That question had haunted explorers, captains, navigators, and even the emperors chosen for 10,000 years. Every Imperial sailor knew that the warp was not simply a path, it was a predator. A living ocean of nightmares, starved and patient, waiting for a single mistake. And yet, despite the whispered tales, despite the disappearances, despite the ships that launched with chanting crew and returned as drifting coffins, humanity had no choice but to enter it again and again. This is the story of one such journey, a voyage that should have been routine, uneventful, another quiet ripple in the endless chronicles of Imperial duty. But instead, it became a memory the galaxy itself tried to bury. The Gloriana's mercy was not a warship carved from ancient heroism nor an ark forged in the foundries of legend. It was a standard Imperial cruiser, honorable, disciplined, reliable. Built to escort convoys, transport regiments, and enforce the Emperor's will across the scattered stars. Its exterior was stern and angular, its hull layered in gray ceramide plates that bore the scars of previous engagements. Not glorious battles, not triumphant crusades, just the scars of duty. Countless skirmishes, raids, border conflicts. Nothing that earned songs, nothing that earned statues. The ship was a worker, a loyal and dutiful tool of the Imperium. Inside its hull lived nearly 23,000 souls. Officers who had served for decades, green deckhands dreaming of glory, hardened voidsmen who scoffed at superstition but still whispered small prayers when passing too close to warp-infested regions. There were engineers who knew every vibration of the reactor's voice, medicae who handled injuries with cold precision, and a small detachment of stormtroopers who preferred silence to conversation. And at the very center, protected by dozens of sealed chambers, stood the navigator's sanctum, where the ship's blind third eye watched paths no mortal could comprehend. On the day the ship departed, the corridors were filled with the disciplined rhythm of preparation. Boots thundered across metal walkways, orders echoed from the Vox systems, and the humming heart of the plasma engines grew louder and steadier. There was a sense of routine in the air, a practiced calm that came from years of experience. Warp travel was dangerous, everyone knew that, but familiarity dulled fear. Most of the crew believed this journey would be no different from dozens before it. Captain Aurelius Marwin stood upon the command deck, hands clasped behind his back, posture straight as if carved from stone. His uniform bore small medals, earned not through glory but through consistency, commendations for reliability, for results delivered without fail. He was respected, trusted, and known for being unshakably calm even under the most disastrous circumstances. His eyes, cold and disciplined, scanned the bridge as servitors clicked through final diagnostics. To him, this mission was simple: transport essential supplies and reinforcement personnel to the far outpost of Sonaran Ix, a world no one wrote songs about. A forgotten mining planet, a speck in the darkness. Yet every speck mattered in the Emperor's domain. On the lower decks, meanwhile, the mood varied. Some crew members spoke excitedly about the destination, imagining new lands or small opportunities for advancement. Others were quieter, exchanging uneasy glances as the Geller field was brought online. Its deep, thundering hum vibrated through the walls, a reminder that without it, the warp would devour them whole. No matter how many jumps a sailor experienced, there was always that moment, a breath held, a silent prayer offered, as real space bent away. The navigator, Serenus Vol, prepared in his private sanctum. His elongated, skull and pallid skin marked him unmistakably as one of his kind. He whispered incantations under his breath, repeating them mechanically, fingers trembling as he felt the warp currents swell beyond the veil. Navigators lived between worlds, never fully mortal, never fully alien. They perceived beauty and abominations in equal measure, their minds constantly pressing against the impossible. And today, Serenus felt something unusual. Not dangerous, not alarming, just a faint dissonance. A distant ripple that made the hair along his arms stand on end. He dismissed it quickly. The warp was always chaotic, always shifting. A flicker of discomfort did not warrant panic. As preparations neared completion, Captain Marwin opened a final Vox channel to the entire ship. His voice echoed through every deck, every corridor, every bunk. Crew of the Gloriana's Mercy, we depart with honor and return with duty fulfilled. Maintain discipline, maintain faith, for the Emperor guides our path. The ship responded with a synchronized chant, thousands of voices overlapping, forming a single, resonant declaration of loyalty. Moments later, the final sequence began. The engines surged. The Geller field flared to life. Reality tightened like a held breath. And with a violent ripple that could not be seen or heard but could be felt by every soul aboard, the Gloriana's Mercy slipped from the safety of real space and entered the ocean of madness. Warp translation. A leap into the unknown. The beginning of a journey no one on the ship would ever forget. For the first few minutes, everything was normal. The hull groaned quietly as cosmic forces pressed against it. The navigator's third eye glowed faintly as he traced shimmering paths through impossible oceans. Crew members returned to their stations, conversations resumed, and the practiced routine of a warp voyage settled over the ship like a comforting blanket. But deep in the metal bones of the vessel, in the spaces between lights and shadows, in the whispered places where no footsteps echoed, something stirred, for the warp had noticed them. And it was waiting. Even inside the disciplined corridors of the Gloriana's Mercy, that question drifted like a cold draft. Not spoken aloud, not acknowledged, but felt. The warp was always unsettling, but this time it felt different. Heavier, stranger, as if the ship hadn't entered the warp, but rather the warp had inhaled the ship into itself. Before we dive deeper into the truth of what happened, before the terror begins to take its true shape, here's a reason to stay with this story until the very end. Because the final revelation of what the crew finds, what they encounter in the heart of the warp, is something most Imperial records refuse to document, something even seasoned navigators refuse to speak about. Stay with me, and by the end, you'll know why their fate was sealed the moment they jumped. At first, the journey began with a familiar rhythm. That low, resonant hum of the Geller field formed the invisible barrier between the ship and the raw insanity pressing against it. Every bulkhead vibrated softly under its protection. Every crew member felt the faint, reassuring warmth of real space clinging to them like a fragile shield. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. But normal does not last long in the warp. Barely 15 minutes after translation, the first irregularity occurred. It wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was so small that most crew wouldn't notice it until much later. A subtle flicker of the ship's chronometers, a 3-second glitch where time stuttered, froze, then lurched forward. For a vessel accustomed to temporal disturbances, this should have meant nothing. Yet the way it happened, the feeling of something brushing against the souls of every person aboard, made even the veteran voidsman whisper silent prayers. Deep in the navigator's sanctum, Serenus Vol felt the disturbance more intensely. He opened his third eye to read the warp currents, expecting the usual chaotic streams of psychic energy. Instead, he saw stillness. A calm, unnatural stillness, like a storm holding its breath. The currents weren't flowing, they were bending, redirecting, as if following a path that Serenus had not chosen. He whispered to himself, impossible. On the bridge, Captain Aurelius Marwin sensed the shift as well, not through psychic ability, but through instinct sharpened by decades of command. The air felt heavier. The ship's lights dimmed for a fraction of a heartbeat. Even the servitors paused mid-task, their mechanical hums hesitating as though they too sensed something unnatural. Then came the second irregularity. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoing through the hull. Too slow to be mechanical. Too organic to be random. It pulsed like a heartbeat, but not a human one, something deeper, older, impossibly vast. Crew members on lower decks reported hearing it first, then the officers on the mid-levels, then finally the bridge itself. A heartbeat that did not belong to the ship. A heartbeat that seemed to belong to the warp. Some claimed it was only a malfunction. Others insisted it was the metal contracting from stress. But in the warp, nothing is ever that simple. The tapping grew stronger, resonating through walls and floors like distant drums calling to something unseen. And when the sound passed beneath the navigator's chambers, Serenus felt a chill run up his spine. He murmured, almost inaudibly, "We're not drifting, we're being followed." But he wasn't ready to announce that. Not yet. The days of Imperial discipline taught him to verify, to confirm, to calculate 1,000 times before speaking aloud. Yet somewhere in the recesses of his mind, a single realization began to bloom like a cold, cruel flower. Something in the warp had noticed them. The ship pressed on, unaware that each passing second brought them closer to an encounter that no Imperial vessel should ever experience. The tapping continued. The chronometers glitched again. The warp currents swirled unnaturally. And for the first time since the journey began, the captain's unshakable calm began to fracture. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. And what happens next is far worse. In the hours that followed the strange heartbeat and the flickering chronometers, the crew of the Gloriana's Mercy tried to settle back into routine. It was an attempt at normalcy, one born more of denial than discipline. That is how fear often begins, not with panic, but with a series of small, almost ignorable distortions that gnaw at the edges of the mind. The warp excels at subtlety, it prefers to loosen the bolts of sanity one thread at a time. A junior deck officer on the observation gantry noticed the first undeniable anomaly. He was logging standard warp turbulence readings when the viewing porthole beside him froze into a sheet of static white. Not the swirling madness of the Immaterium, just white, endless white, like the universe had blinked out. He leaned closer, confused, and for the briefest fraction of a second, he saw his own reflection move independently of him. Not a delayed echo, not a mechanical glitch, his reflection turned its head first. He stumbled back, heart hammering in his chest, but by the time he called another officer, the view had returned to normal, the warp roiling with violent, familiar colors. On the mess deck, a group of voidsmen discussed the incident in hushed tones even though no one had officially recorded it. Every man and woman in that room had sailed the warp long enough to know one truth: if members of the crew start seeing things, you don't ask them to explain. You simply listen, nod, and hope you aren't next. But the anomalies were growing more frequent. Doors that closed properly moments earlier refused to seal. Vox systems crackled with phantom voices speaking in static-laced fragments. A deckhand swore he heard someone whisper his childhood nickname, one no one aboard could possibly know. A mechanic felt a hand rest on his shoulder while he was alone in the engine vault. When he turned, there was no one, but his shoulder still tingled with an ice-cold pressure. The medical bay soon reported its own disturbance. A patient recovering from a fractured arm claimed he had seen the Medicae treating him split into two for a second, one continuing the procedure, the other standing motionless with hollow, blackened eyes. The Medicae dismissed it as pain-induced delirium, but he felt the unease settle into his bones. And through it all, the tapping continued. Steady, methodical, closer. In the navigator's chambers, Serenus Vol felt the warp curling strangely around the ship. The psychic currents that normally flowed like violent rivers now twisted in synchronized spirals around the vessel, almost as if intentionally coiling. He tried adjusting course, but every shift was met with unnatural resistance. Not physical resistance, psychic. The warp didn't push back. It redirected. He knew then what the others feared to even imagine. The ship was not merely adrift, it was being guided. But toward what? On the bridge, Captain Aurelius Marwin maintained iron control outwardly, but even he felt the pressure mounting. The reports coming from across the ship were too similar, too consistent. Dozens of small distortions, none catastrophic, all unnerving. He requested a full diagnostic sweep. It came back clear. He ordered a Geller field recalibration. The field was stable. He consulted the navigator. Serenus only said, "Captain, the warp is not behaving as it should." That was the first time in Marwan's long career he heard a navigator admit uncertainty. It chilled him in a way battle never could. Then came the moment no one could deny. Every chronometer aboard the Gloriana's Mercy, every handheld device, every bridge-locked clock, every mechanical and digital counter, stopped at the exact same second. Not for a blink, not for a heartbeat, for almost a full minute. Imagine 23,000 people holding their breath, watching time itself refuse to move. Standing in dim corridors, on steel platforms, in engine rooms, in prayer cells, staring at clocks that had always obeyed. Seconds became eternity. A minute became a suffocating ocean. And then, with a sudden jolt, every chronometer restarted, each one now displaying a different time. Some jumped forward hours. Some reversed by days. Some displayed impossible dates from forgotten millennia. Panic erupted. Not loudly, not with screams or chaos. This panic was silent, cold, crawling beneath the skin. People stared at their clocks like they had witnessed a death. The death of certainty. The death of control. The warp was no longer outside the ship. It was beginning to drip inside. They had only just entered the Immaterium. And already, something was reaching for them. The Gloriana's Mercy had not yet realized the truth, but the warp had chosen them. And the nightmare was only beginning. The first hints of dread had been subtle, chronometers glitching, reflections moving wrong, whispers threading through empty corridors. But now, the disturbances sharpened into something undeniable. The Gloriana's Mercy wasn't just experiencing warp turbulence or routine anomalies. It was drifting deeper into a region where even navigators feared to gaze. One by one, systems began to fail, not completely, not dramatically, but with a quiet, unnerving precision. The ship's long-range Auspex screens displayed nothing but shifting storms of psychic fog. Attempted pings into real space returned only distorted echoes. The hull groaned with a hollow, metallic resonance that engineers could not explain. Even the lights took on a faint, sickly tinge as if reacting to an unseen pressure. In the navigator's sanctum, Serenus Val's third eye throbbed painfully. The warp paths that normally burst with chaotic energy now appeared stretched thin, like veins pulled taut across an unimaginable void. It felt as though the ship wasn't navigating a current, but being slowly pulled along a downward spiral. He reached out psychically, pushing deeper, searching for any familiar pattern, any star's psychic resonance, any beacon, any echo of real space. There was nothing, no guiding light, no reference point, only an endless dark swirl beneath them, like a mouth waiting to swallow. Serenus exhaled shakily. "We are off course," he whispered, though the words tasted inadequate. They weren't simply lost. They had passed a point where the warp ceased behaving like the warp. This place did not follow rules or currents. It felt designed, intentional. On the bridge, Captain Aurelius Marwan reviewed the incoming reports with increasing alarm. System logs contradicted one another. Navigation charts were unreadable. The Geller field, still active, was fluctuating by fractions of a percent, but enough to cause the ship's edges to blur in and out of phase. Crew in outer corridors reported distortions, walls that curved slightly where they should be straight, shadows stretching with minds of their own. And then came the message from the astropathic choir. Not a communication, an absence of one. The choir reported that their psychic reach had been severed entirely. Not blocked, not jammed, cut. It was as if space beyond the hull no longer existed. They described it as standing in a room with no windows, no doors, and no ceiling, just endless black. The captain attempted to run emergency warp recalibration routines. The system responded with an error code none of the tech priests recognized. When they tried to decrypt the meaning, the screen flickered and returned a single word, printed in jagged, glitched type. Descent. A word no Imperial machine should ever output. A cold silence overtook the bridge. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. Even the servitors seemed to pause, as though the message had reached something deep within their metal-buried flesh. Marwan clenched his jaw. "Navigator Val, report. The Vox speaker crackled. Serenus's voice trembled, stripped of its usual composure. "Captain, the warp is folding around us. This region is not charted. It is not safe. We are no longer following a stable route. Something is pulling us deeper." "Define something." There was a long, dreadful silence. Finally, Serenus answered, "I do not know if it is a current, or a consciousness." The words hit the crew like a physical blow. A consciousness. A living will within the warp. Not a demon, not yet. Not a storm. Not random energy. Something aware. Something vast. Something that had seen them. On the lower decks, the tapping that had echoed for hours grew louder, resonating like a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. Bulkheads trembled faintly with each pulse. Crew whispered that the sound seemed to match a heartbeat again. But not theirs. Not human. Not mortal. The ship's chapel filled with anxious prayers. The Medicae Bay saw a spike in panic attacks. Officers tried to restore order, but fear crawled through the vessel like a spreading infection. Then, at precisely 3:16 shipboard time, though time had no meaning anymore, the Geller field flickered for an instant. Just long enough for every crew member to feel a cold, alien presence brush against their mind. Just long enough to hear a whisper. It spoke no language. It carried no meaning. It was not a command. It was simply acknowledgement. A greeting from something in the depths of the warp. Something that had found them. Only then, standing in the dim light of the failing bridge, Captain Marwin fully understood. They were not lost. They were being taken. That was exactly how the crew of the Gloriana's Mercy began to feel as the ship sank deeper into the warp. The subtle anomalies had grown sharper. The chronometers no longer merely stuttered, they now raced in impossible increments, seconds stretching and compressing unpredictably. Hallways warped as if the metal itself were breathing, walls curving in unnatural angles. Even the hum of the engines vibrated with a peculiar resonance, like a muted echo of a heartbeat far larger than any human or machine. Sleep became impossible. Those who closed their eyes were pulled into visions more real than life, more vivid than memory. One deckhand woke screaming, claiming to have lived 1,000 lives in a single night. He had commanded fleets, led invasions, been crushed under mountains, drowned in oceans, and burned in fires, only to awaken minutes later in the same corridor he had left. Others began sleepwalking through hallways, muttering phrases in tongues none recognized. Even the Medicae could not explain the sudden spikes in psychological trauma. They were witnessing the very minds of men unraveling, piece by piece. The first casualty came quietly. An engineer inspecting the outer hull vanished without warning. His tools fell to the deck, his body was gone. The only trace was a lingering echo in the Geller field, a high-pitched vibration that set teeth on edge and nerves screaming. When search teams investigated, they found nothing. Not a mark, not a footprint, not a trace of entry or exit. It was as though the warp itself had simply claimed him. Captain Marwin convened an emergency meeting. The bridge was tense, faces pale, voices low. "Report," he demanded, though he feared the answer he would receive. The navigator's face was pale, etched with lines from a night of sleepless vigilance. "It is no longer a matter of drift, Captain," Serenus said, voice trembling. "The warp is interacting with us. Responding, adjusting to our presence. We are no longer passengers. We are prey." The word, prey, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The crew had read tales, rumors in whispers, of ships caught in warp currents that never returned. But a predator, something that watches, waits, and feeds. That was a nightmare more profound than any demon or starship disaster. The idea that the universe itself could perceive them, shape itself around them, and test them, it was more than terrifying, it was unimaginable. And yet, it was real. The first encounter came in the form of shadows moving inside the Geller field. Not reflections, not hallucinations. Solid, dark shapes that writhed and twisted, drifting through corridors as if the walls were liquid. Systems reacted unpredictably, the lights dimmed in bursts, engines pulsed with erratic vibrations, and the crew began reporting a low-frequency hum, harmonizing with the heartbeat tapping that had begun hours earlier. The navigator recoiled, whispering prayers long forgotten to him. This was no longer mere turbulence. This was a hunting ground. And they were being hunted. Some crew began to break. Eyes darted to corners that weren't there moments before. Hands shook uncontrollably while typing logs. A chorus of whispered warnings spread through the decks like an infection. It knows we're here. The words were spoken in different decks, by different people, yet the phrasing was identical. The warp had begun to speak. Not through the navigator. Not through messages. Through the crew themselves. It bent minds to its will, threaded fear into thought, and toyed with the perception of reality. And when the navigator attempted to probe deeper, to push the ship toward escape, he realized with horror that something enormous had taken notice. The currents no longer twisted randomly, they pulled. A vast, unseen intelligence was aware of the Gloriana's mercy, guiding them toward a destination that was not theirs, to a fate that had been waiting long before they ever entered the warp. The ship was alive, and it was hungry. The Gloriana's mercy had survived the first hours of the warp's subtle manipulations, but survival was no longer enough. Slowly, inexorably, the ship began to claim the minds of its crew. At first, it was small. A whisper here, a fleeting shadow there. Sleep became restless, dreams bled into waking thought. Crew members reported strange, vivid recollections, memories that weren't their own, lives they had never lived, conversations with people who had never existed. These weren't nightmares, they were simulations of reality, so detailed that reality itself began to feel like the intruder. Those who tried to rationalize it found themselves failing. Engineers spent hours tracing phantom power fluctuations that weren't there. Medicaid treated stress-induced seizures with sedatives, only to find patients awake, staring at blank walls, whispering in foreign tongues. Deckhands began sleepwalking, some returning to their bunks with bloodied hands and no recollection of leaving the corridors. Even the most disciplined officers felt the creeping cold of doubt gnaw at their judgment. Time itself began to twist. The same corridor appeared differently each time it was crossed. Hallways looped infinitely, doors opened to rooms that should not exist, and voices echoed from places that had no acoustics. Some clocks ran backward, others counted off centuries in seconds. And through it all, the persistent heartbeat continued, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to originate not from the ship, but from some massive, unseen presence outside reality, pressing against the hull and pressing against minds in equal measure. The navigator, Serenus Vol, was first to notice the true horror. His visions of the warp became unbearable. The currents no longer obeyed reason. Waves of psychic energy folded over themselves like living paper, creating labyrinths of perception that the navigator could neither navigate nor fully comprehend. In moments of clarity, he glimpsed forms, colossal, incomprehensible shapes, that drifted just outside the edge of understanding, watching, waiting, laughing silently at the tiny human minds tethered to the ship. One by one, the crew began to succumb. Some spoke aloud of impossible visions, cities burning in violet flames, forests of bones, stars that bled like living wounds. Others remained silent, paralyzed by fear, their minds retreating into inner sanctums where only fragments of reality survived. The captain tried to maintain order, but discipline could not compete with the warp. Orders given in clear, authoritative tones were ignored. Men and women wandered aimlessly, retracing their steps over and over, muttering names and events that never happened. Even the communications systems began to betray them. When messages were sent to Sonaran Ix, the signals returned scrambled, carrying fragments of words that made sense to no one. Some claims suggested that the messages were answering themselves, signals bending and reshaping reality in a way that implied understanding. The crew began to whisper, realizing that it wasn't just the ship being tested, it was their minds. The warp was aware of them individually, learning them, anticipating them, feeding on their fear. Sleep deprivation, déjà vu, and hallucinations combined until the line between what was real and what was imagined dissolved entirely. Some claimed to see the dead crew members of previous Imperial ships, spectral echoes walking silently beside them. Others reported encountering versions of themselves, empty shells that mimicked their behavior perfectly, mocking them silently, always observing, always judging. And still, the heartbeat grew louder. It was not just a sound. It was a presence, something immense, something intelligent, something patient. It moved with them, through them, and around them. The warp had stopped being an ocean to cross. It had become a predator, a sentient labyrinth, and they were trapped inside. For the crew of the Gloriana's Mercy, reality had become a cage of the mind, and every door, every corridor, every shadow could hide death, or worse, an unending cycle of terror that no one could escape. Some whispered that they should jump into the void, abandon the ship, or even surrender to the hallucinations. Few dared speak these thoughts aloud, and even fewer had the courage to act. And somewhere, deep in the navigator's consciousness, a single terrifying certainty emerged: they were no longer navigating the warp. The warp was navigating them. The anomalies aboard the Gloriana's Mercy had ceased being subtle. Time, space, and perception now bent in ways that defied understanding. Corridors no longer led where they should. They twisted upon themselves like ribbons in a storm, folding reality in impossible angles. Crew members found themselves retracing steps endlessly, sometimes returning to locations they had never seen, other times walking past the same bulkhead that appeared to shift subtly in width and height. The ship had become a labyrinth, and even its creators could not remember its geometry. Lights flickered at irregular intervals, shadows stretching and shrinking independently of their sources. Sometimes the illumination would bleed across walls, revealing shapes just beyond comprehension, tall figures that disappeared the instant they were fully perceived, angles that seemed alive, textures that appeared to crawl with motion when stared at too long. The Geller field, while holding back the worst of the warp's chaos, now acted more like a lens than a barrier, amplifying distortions rather than preventing them. The crew began reporting dizziness, nausea, and vertigo as the ship seemed to breathe and pulse like a living thing. The navigator's mind strained under the pressure. Serenus Vol could no longer differentiate between the real currents of the warp and the deceptive structures forming around them. Paths appeared only to fold back upon themselves. The distant whispers grew louder, echoing not through the air, but directly inside the skull, repeating names, memories, fears, and secrets no one could have known. Every thought became a battleground, every decision suspect. Even the simplest choice, turn left or right in a corridor, felt like stepping into an unpredictable nightmare with consequences beyond imagination. Crew members began to vanish. Not in the dramatic sense, no alarms, no screams. They simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only an inexplicable emptiness. A deckhand walking to the engine room would turn a corner, and the space where he had been just moments before seemed to have never contained him. When colleagues retraced their path, no trace remained. Even the ship's internal sensors showed no anomaly, no void, no breach, just absence. The whispers suggested reasons, but no one could interpret them reliably. It was as if reality itself had begun to erase their existence. The captain maintained a facade of control, issuing commands that felt increasingly hollow against the overwhelming chaos. "Lock your stations. Maintain your posts. Do not panic," he ordered, but the words no longer held weight. Officers reported seeing duplicates of themselves walking silently past consoles, mimicking their actions a second too late, always with an expressionless mask. The duplicates did not speak, did not acknowledge reality, yet seemed entirely sentient. Some crew members swore the doubles were taunting them, while others believed they were the doubles, and they were the originals being haunted. The Geller field flickered again, and this time, the hum of the ship seemed almost human, an echoing sigh of inevitability. Gravity in certain sections of the vessel shifted without explanation, pulling crew toward walls, ceilings, even ceilings that were not truly ceilings. In the mess halls, chairs stacked themselves into impossible configurations. In the medic bay, equipment floated mid-air for seconds, then snapped back into place. Reality was no longer consistent. It obeyed rules only the warp, or the entity observing them, dictated. In private, Serenus confessed to the captain, the warp is no longer an environment. It is a presence, and it is shaping the ship according to its will. It is alive, Captain. A predator. And it knows we are here. Marwan's jaw tightened. He had commanded countless missions across hostile space, fought countless enemies, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing in the codices, nothing in Imperial doctrine, could have prepared the crew for a reality where walls, corridors, and even time itself could be weaponized. The ship was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a trap. And then the first deaths occurred. Not gruesome, not immediate. Just sudden absence, followed by the slow realization that reality itself had rejected them. A deck officer walked into a corridor to investigate a minor alarm and was gone in the blink of an eye. The sensor logs recorded him stepping forward, and nothing afterward. No body. No trace. Just gone. Panic spread silently. Eyes darted to corners that no longer seemed fixed, hands trembled over controls that no longer responded predictably, and the hum of the heartbeat, always there, always waiting, grew louder. The ship was alive, and it was not merely observing. It was learning, adapting, testing. The Gloriana's mercy had become more than lost. It had become prey. The first death aboard the Gloriana's mercy was not violent. It was silent, almost imperceptible, and yet it struck terror deeper than any battle or attack could. A young deckhand, assigned to routine maintenance, entered a dimly lit corridor that twisted and curved unnaturally. Moments later, when another crew member arrived to check on him, he was gone. No blood, no body, not even a trace of his presence remained. It was as if the corridor had swallowed him whole. The medicae were called immediately, though they knew, even before arriving, that there was nothing to treat. When the logs were examined, they confirmed the impossible. He had walked in, and then simply ceased to exist. Time had recorded his steps, but space had rejected him. Even the ship's sensors could find no anomaly. It was a disappearance that defied every law of physics, every principle of Imperial engineering, every understanding of reality. Panic, quiet but pervasive, spread across the crew. People stopped speaking aloud, fearing that to acknowledge the absence would invite it closer. Hushed whispers described the unnatural twisting of the ship's corridors, the way the walls seemed to close in, and the strange pulse that vibrated through bulkheads in rhythm with that relentless heartbeat. Crew members began avoiding certain decks, certain halls, certain rooms, areas they instinctively felt were unsafe. But instinct offered no protection. Then came the second disappearance. A mid-level officer investigating a console reported that the system was displaying multiple conflicting data streams, none of which made sense. The logs indicated the officer had walked to the terminal, and then vanished mid-step. The console itself continued to function normally, as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the loss was the creeping dread that gnawed at the remaining crew. Fear became a contagion. Those left began to speak in hushed tones of demons, of warp entities, of ancient powers that had claimed ships before them. The Geller field flickered more often, as if straining under the pressure of not just the warp, but something conscious pressing against it. Some crew members swore the walls themselves seemed to watch, curving subtly to observe, to manipulate, to push. Others described hearing the faintest scraping sounds behind doors that had never opened. By the end of the first cycle aboard the ship, 5 crew members had vanished without explanation. Every disappearance followed the same pattern, a single person, moving about their duties, then simply gone, leaving behind an absence that could not be measured, counted, or explained. The air felt heavier, charged with invisible tension. Fear had become almost tangible, pressing on the chest, clouding thought, eroding courage. Captain Marwan convened a bridge meeting, his voice calm but edged with tension. "We will maintain order," he said firmly. "No one moves alone. Stick to assigned pairs. Report any anomalies immediately." But even as he spoke, he knew the rules no longer mattered. The ship had become a hunting ground, the warp no longer a medium but a predator. Each crew member could feel it, a presence pressing just beyond perception, learning their routines, testing their reactions, waiting. And then came the hardest realization: these deaths were not random. They were deliberate. Something was watching, choosing, selecting. Not out of malice in a human sense, but with a cold, calculating efficiency that made every heartbeat, every breath, every step a matter of life or death. By the time the sun should have risen on the far side of real space, though the concept of time had begun to lose meaning, the surviving crew understood the grim truth. The Gloriana's mercy was no longer a vessel under human command. It was a living prison. And the warp had already started to feed. The first deaths were only the beginning. The disappearances shattered the fragile illusion of control aboard the Gloriana's mercy. Where once discipline and routine had reigned, now only unease and suspicion thrived. Crew members began whispering about abandoning posts, wandering alone, or refusing orders. In the cramped corridors, even trusted officers found their authority questioned. The once cohesive crew now moved like isolated islands in a storm, each person suspecting the other of influencing the horrors that stalked them. By the third day of the warp voyage, tension had escalated to open mutiny. A group of junior officers, terrified and convinced that the captain's orders were leading them all to death, refused to follow navigation directives. Some barricaded themselves in lower decks, claiming the ship itself was conspiring against them. Others attempted to forcibly override the bridge controls, desperate to redirect the vessel away from the unseen threat. Their logic was simple: if the warp was alive and hunting them, any action to assert control, even rebellion, was preferable to passivity. Captain Marwan tried to maintain calm and authority, but his commands were met with suspicion, hesitation, or outright defiance. Every voice on the bridge became a potential threat, every hand on a console a possible agent of chaos. Even loyalists began to falter under the weight of constant psychological assault. The whispers, the shifting corridors, and the persistent heartbeat seemed to gnaw at reason itself. Isolation became the only refuge. Crew members retreated to private quarters, Medicae bays, or abandoned sections of the ship, hoping to shield themselves from the growing madness. But isolation only magnified the warp's influence. Those left alone began to experience hallucinations more vivid and terrifying than before. Echoes of missing crew members calling for help, glimpses of impossible landscapes outside the hull, and reflections of themselves that no longer resembled their own faces. Sleep became a dangerous act, for dreams now merged seamlessly with waking reality, leaving no certainty as to what was true. The navigator, Serenus Vol, observed these changes with growing dread. The warp was no longer just testing them, it was shaping their behavior. Panic and fear were contagious, bending decisions, twisting loyalty, and breaking the social fabric of the crew. He realized that survival depended not only on skill and knowledge but on mental fortitude. Yet, the longer they remained in this section of the warp, the more impossible that became. Communication between decks deteriorated further. Officers sent orders that were either ignored or misinterpreted. Small arguments erupted into violent confrontations over trivial matters, each fight fueled by paranoia and exhaustion. The sense of a collective threat had shifted to a personal one. Every crew member feared not only the warp, but their companions, and even themselves. Some whispered about abandoning the navigator entirely, hoping to chart the warp on their own, oblivious to the fact that doing so would accelerate death. Others proposed desperate rituals to appease whatever consciousness had claimed them.